Hello and welcome to RHP's Lease Extensions presentation with Lynnette Rolph, Homeowner Advisor.
Hello everybody, thanks for joining us on this webinar about lease extensions. It's something that's cropping up more and more now because leases obviously are getting shorter with each year that passes by. So let's have a look at the most commonly asked for information. So, why should I extend my lease? Now this is, if you're not familiar with leasehold law and legislation, this is probably the first question you would ask. You may or you may not know, but all RHP leases were originally granted for 125 years. But that might not be 125 years from the date the property was sold, your particular property was sold. It might be 125 years from the date the first flat in your block was sold. So, for example, the first sales took place of flats in 1980. So if one was sold in a block in 1980, 125 years later, that would be 2,105. So if you're looking at one now that was sold in 1980, that leaves you 91 years. So you'd have a minimum of 91 years left on any one lease, and that's if the property was sold at the earliest possible time of 1980. So why would you want to extend your lease? Well, it protects your investment, because obviously buying a property is the most significant investment most people make in their lifetime, and you would want to protect that. So having a long lease is more valuable than having a short lease. So by extending your lease, you're actually protecting your investment. It also makes it easier to get a mortgage, because most mortgage lenders want to lend on a property with a long lease because it's better security for them, and obviously they're investing, so they want to make sure that their investment's protected as well. And finally, it makes it easier to sell your home, because most people will, a long lease is more attractive to most purchasers, and that's what most people will look for. So for example, if you've got two flats for sale in the same block, or neighbouring blocks, the flats might be identical, but say one's got a 105-year lease and the other one's got 85-year lease, then the one with the longer lease is going to be more attractive to buy. So hopefully that will make it easier for you to sell when you consider moving on. When should I extend my lease? Now this is pretty significant, so it might be worth remembering this number of 80 years, the magic number as I call it, of 80 years. And this is because once you've got a lease that's less than 80 years, it becomes more expensive to extend, and it also means that mortgage lenders and prospective buyers are less likely to lend or to buy once a lease gets to below 80 years. Again, because mortgage lenders are looking for a long lease to protect their security, and buyers are looking for long leases because they don't want to have to go through the expense of having to extend. So once you get to less than 80 years, something called marriage value comes into the equation when you're working out how much it's going to cost to extend your lease. Now, marriage value is defined as the increase in the value of the property following the completion of the lease extension, reflecting the additional market value of the longer lease. So effectively it's because it makes the property more valuable, having a longer lease on it, and that comes into effect at 80 years. So once a lease gets to below 80 years, that's when it becomes more expensive to extend, and more difficult if you want to sell or to get a mortgage on it. So how can you extend your lease? Well, there's a very useful independent advice service for leaseholders, which I can't recommend highly enough. It's called the Leasehold Advisory Service. It's known as Lease for short, L-E-A-S-E. It's, as I say, it's independent, and they've got loads and loads of really useful advice on there for homeowners and also for landlords as well. So we refer to it sometimes if we want to check something out as well. And now on our website, in the homeowner zone, we've put a link which takes you straight through to the Lease website. So just have a look on the homeowner zone and you'll see the link there. So you can either go through on that link to the website, or you can have a look yourself at the website, and they have some really useful advice guides, including one called Lease Extensions Getting Started. And you can download that from our RHP website, or you can download it from the Lease website. And I really recommend you read that book because it's got everything in there that you need to know about lease extensions. So I would suggest that you read advice from the advice from the Leasehold Advisory Service website. You get your own legal advice as well, because obviously we can give you information but we can't give you advice. You need your independent legal advice. And you would need to have some idea of what the valuation might be for your premium. So it might be worth speaking to a valuer before you make your application, just so that you've got an idea of what your premium might be. In the booklet, the Lease Extensions Getting Started booklet, it does recommend that you use the services of a valuer to assess the premium. Then once you've done all that, you can serve the tenant's notice. This is usually served by your solicitor. It's a legal notice under the Leasehold and Common Hold Reform Act 2002, and basically it means that once you've served this notice, the whole process is comes under a piece of legislation. So that means that we will follow the legislation, but the main thing for you to remember is that once you serve the tenant's notice, you are then committed to paying our legal fees and our valuation fees, even if you decide not to go ahead. So that's why it's important for you to get independent advice first, so that you've got an idea of what costs might be before you serve the notice, because obviously we wouldn't want you to be paying our fees if you decide later not to go ahead. And the burning question most people want to know, how much does it cost? Well, on the Leasehold Advisory Service website, they have a calculator, which is really good, and it gives you an approximate idea of what a premium might be. Obviously they can't guarantee that this is an accurate figure, but it does give you a ballpark figure. So do have a look at that on the Leasehold Advisory Service website. You do need to have a valuation carried out to give an exact calculation, but as I say, you can get approximate costs on using the lease calculator on the website. So apart from the premium, as I mentioned earlier, you'd also have to pay the landlord's legal and valuation costs. So do bear that in mind before you make your application. Now I can give you an idea of what they are at the moment, but obviously they may vary slightly. But currently our legal fees are approximately £600. That's for our solicitor. We don't make any profit on this. This is literally just what we pay our solicitor to do the work. The valuation fee is the same. It's the money that the valuer charges us, and that's £720. Then we also have to get our lender's approval, which costs around another £180. So that's a total of about £1,500 for our legal fees and valuation fees. Then of course you'd have your own legal fees, your own valuation fees, and cost of the premium. So, excuse me, something to bear in mind before you make the application. So, any questions?
Thank you, Lynnette. That was a very interesting presentation. The first question that we have is, how do I find out how long I have left on my lease extension?
Now this is on the lease itself. Now I don't know how many of you will actually have a copy of your own lease. Your solicitor should have given you a copy when you bought the property, but I know sometimes they don't. There's a copy lodged with the land registry, which you can get by paying a fee, or we have a copy here, held here, which we can access. And very shortly we'll actually be putting these on our My Home Online service, so you'll be able to see your own lease free of charge. And but it's not quite available yet, so in the meantime, if you don't have a copy of your lease, contact us and we'll have a look at it on our system for you. If you do have your lease in front of you, there are some slight variations of leases, but I've got three slightly different leases in front of me, and it's all in the same place. So usually on page 2 of the lease, there'll be a heading that says, "Now this deed witnesseth as follows," and then it talks about how much was paid when the property was first sold, way back whenever. And then at the bottom of that paragraph, it will say, there'll be a date. It will say, the term hereby granted be subject unto the lessee from, and there'll be a date, for example, 27th day of June 1988, for the term of 125 years. So on this particular example I'm looking at, the property was, this particular property was sold in 1998, but because there was one already sold in the block earlier, the lease started in 1988. So the reason for this is because when the leases were first drafted, they all had to finish at the same time. So obviously they all had to finish on the same day. Since the stock transfer, however, in the year 2000, we're now granting leases for 125 years from the date that particular flat is sold. But for the majority of people who already own a flat, they would have been sold before the stock transfer originally. So the 125 years, as I say, will normally run from the date the first flat in that block was sold. But it is set out in your lease on page 2.
Thank you, Lynnette. Next question. What if I was to leave my lease until it reached 50 years?
Well, we wouldn't really want you to leave your lease to get as short as 50 years, because I can give some examples of evaluation for premium, for example, of a flat worth £250,000. So if a flat's worth £250,000 and you've got 99 years left on your lease, the premium might cost you between £2,000 and £3,000. However, that changes significantly if you've got, say, 79 years left on the lease. That increases to a premium of between £7,000 and £8,000. What you don't want is to leave it to 50 years, because the premium bumps up then to between £38,000 and £41,000. There's a massive difference if you have a very short lease. So we certainly wouldn't want you to leave it to get to below the magic number of 80 years is always best.
Thank you. And the next question, what happens to my ground rent?
Once you've extended your lease, you don't actually pay ground rent any longer. So with a lease extension, you get an extra 90 years on top of what's already left. So for example, if you had 90 years left on your lease now and you extended it, you'd have an additional 90 years, which makes 180. So you would have a 180-year lease with what they call a peppercorn rent. So you wouldn't pay your £10 a year ground rent any longer. You'd just be paying, well, we would never ask you to pay it, because a peppercorn rent is effectively minimum ground rent. So that would save you £10 a year.
Great. And our last question is, can we get a lease extension as a group of leaseholders in a block of flats?
I have asked our solicitors and our valuer about this, because I was hoping that we might be able to make some savings both in time and excuse me, money, but unfortunately the answer is the same from both, that the same amount of work applies whether one person in a block applies to extend their lease or 4 or 5 people apply. So the solicitor and the valuer still has to do the same amount of work, and they're therefore unable to reduce costs, I'm afraid. It might be useful to get a bit of support from each other so that you all going through the process at the same time, but in terms of saving money, I'm afraid it wouldn't.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lynnette, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you found the presentation interesting and useful. For those of you who haven't been able to access chat or would prefer to email, please could you use customer.services@rhp.org.uk, and you should actually see the email address on your screen now, and your customer advisor or a member of the team will contact you back. Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a good evening.
Yep, thanks very much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.